It is really a privilege to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation and offering an opportunity for me to talk about something that is very close to my heart, sex and gender in research and SAGER guideline in particular. I'm hoping to categorize, kind of structure my talk into 4 different sections, starting with why do sex and gender matter in research, then talking about what are the issues or problems with the current research and reporting practices, and then finishing with what are the SAGER guidelines and how can they help address the gender evidence gap. I'll start by talking about sex and gender and the terminology around those, as these terms are often used interchangeably, but in particular in research, there are important distinguishes to be made that is good to keep in mind. We're often talking about sex when we are referring to biological differences or biological sex characteristics and features, which stems from our differential chromosomal composition, but results also in differential gene expression, hormones, physiology, anatomy, and so on and so forth. Gender, on the other hand, is a socially constructed norm, roles, relationships, behaviors, responsibilities, values, and attitudes, and form of power that a given society assigns to women and men. Gender has multiple dimensions, and one dimension of it is gender identity, which is actually a more inherent sense of identity, an inherent felt sense of one's gender identity, which might align or not align with the sex that was assigned at birth. Now, gender norms are not by nature harmful, but they can be harmful if they result in being mistreated over the other gender, or there are differences in creating power and opportunities that lead to discrimination, disadvantage, and inequality. So we usually say that we are born with a sex, but we are socialized into a gender. Now, why is it important to consider sex and gender in research? Now, sex and gender play a very important role when it comes to our health and well-being. Biological sex influences our susceptibility to diseases, presentation of symptoms, drug metabolism, response to vaccine and autogens and pathogens, and a number of different biological experiences. Our gender, on the other hand, influences our vulnerability to disease, risk-taking behavior, exposure to risk, interaction with healthcare system, healthcare providers, and a number of different dimensions. And in reality, there is also an interplay between sex and gender. We also know that our environmental factor can have an influence on our physiological responses, and the vice versa as well, that some physiological responses can also influence the way we behave or respond in a more kind of a social way. And sex and gender differences have been observed in all clinical entities. To date, I have not been coming across any health or disease area where sex and gender could not play an important role. In particular, gender plays a very important role because gender is also very much embedded in our institutions, in our research institutions, health system, educational institutions, and it really influences the way we are operating in terms of both political decision and different decisions that influences prioritization, investment, operation, and so on and so forth. When it comes to health system, again, gender consideration can play a very important role because they can decide what priority is given to women's, men's, and gender non-conforming people's health services, decisions about which services should be offered. In particular, we know that sexual and reproductive health services, abortion services in particular, are highly subject to political decisions that are, again, informed by patriarchal norms and beliefs. Resource allocation in terms of financial, human, facilities, equipment, drugs and supplies, quality of care, and experience of stigma and discrimination or provider attitude in the healthcare, and of course, community engagement and participation in decision-making about all of those above. So it kind of highlights how all of these aspects are highly gendered and influenced by gender norms. As mentioned, gender really influences a wide range of issues that impact our health in terms of risk exposure and vulnerability to disease, access to and utilization of services, behavior, healthcare seeking patterns, prevention, treatment, and management options, experiences within the health system, as well as health and social implications. Gender can also impact our health and well-being beyond the health system and the health research in itself. You have obviously more recently as well seen the devastating impact of hurricane. And many years ago, I came across this really interesting article in the Journal of PNAS that showcased that female hurricanes are deadlier than male hurricanes. Now, they had looked at the hurricanes are actually named randomly, kind of chronologically following an arbitrary list of names. And they had adjusted for intensity of the hurricanes and yet found that hurricanes with feminine names were causing more damage. And I was very curious about this because obviously hurricanes in itself are not gendered, but the conclusion that they took, and they had done some other experiments as well, that the reason is that individuals systematically underestimate their vulnerability to hurricanes with more feminine names, avoiding or delaying protective measures. So it's a very interesting example that showcases how our gender assumptions can influence our risk-taking or risk aversion broader than just health system settings. And important to also keep in mind that obviously women as a group or men as a group or people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities as a group are not homogeneous, and gender intersects very much with other dimensions of inequity and inequality to further disadvantage certain groups. And we know that intersectionality identifies how power relations interact gender and other drivers to produce differences in the health experience and outcomes. And those could be race and ethnicity, age, poverty, disability, sexual orientation, migration status, displacement, and other factors. So it's important to keep that in mind that, again, while gender is one intersecting dimension, there are also other variables and other dimensions of inequality that can influence our experiences. So with that in mind, so we know that we have sex and gender differences in health matters. So what is the problem? So the problem is that despite the fact that we have known for a very long time that sex and gender differences are well recognized in the health and medicine in particular, and that they influence our experience of health, still there is quite a resistance to some extent, perhaps, but also ignorance of systematically looking at these dimensions, both in research as well as in policy and practice. And in that sense, the medical system and medical research has been a little bit of an androcentric operation where the white male has been a little bit of the point of reference, and women and people of other ethnicities and races have been assumed to respond similarly to kind of that average reference with some minor modifications. And we see that gender bias in research is very common, and we still see that today. These are just some examples to showcase both in terms of underrepresentation of women in clinical trials, as well as the reporting of clinical trials by considering sex and gender dimensions. A recent study that looked at oncology trials that led to the approval of 17 new drugs showcased that only 38% of those clinical trial participants were women. And another study that looked at over 89,221 oncology trials in the trial trove found that only 0.5% of all trials compared outcome by sex. And these are actually quite recent findings. But we see those biases also in preclinical research. Again, studies have shown that 75% of studies in highly cited immunology journals did not specify whether the animals used were male or female. And in another in another kind of a review of articles with experimental cell culture, similarly, only about 1/3, 36.5% of cells used in the study reported the sex of the cell. So it shows that how much lack of knowledge we have, even already in the preclinical studies and animal studies. And poor reporting of sex and gender dimension of which has been widely documented. In my team, we carried out a systematic review quite many years ago, looking at clinical trials with antiretrovirals. We know that HIV is affecting more than 50% of women worldwide. And as such, there is an expectation that the clinical trials would also mirror that reality. However, when looking at the reporting of sex and gender dimensions in clinical trials with antiretroviral, only 17% looked at these dimensions, and there were quite the underrepresentation at that time of women in clinical trials as well. But that unfortunately persists. And we did another systematic review of the clinical trials, the clinical studies with COVID-19 in 2021. And we saw similarly that while gender balance have improved over time, still analysis by sex and gender, as well as reporting of data disaggregated by sex, is still highly rare. And this is with a virus that we knew very early on that had both sex differences and gender differences in terms of both risk and severity of disease and outcome. So with that in mind, the problem seems to be that we are turning a blind eye to gender-blind research and reporting. Studies are rarely designed with sex and gender in mind and are often not gender balanced. Sex or gender of subjects are often not reported when authors publish their findings. If sex or gender of subjects are reported, it's often in the demographic and baseline data, and outcomes are rarely disaggregated by sex. And often analysis ignore potential sex and gender dimensions, and findings are presented as if of general applicability, which we call as overgeneralization. And that is problematic because ignoring sex and gender in research has multiple disadvantages. One, it can cause harm. It can also reduce reproducibility and is obviously as such a waste of research, but it also compromises rigor of a study if we cannot see and observe differences that could be meaningful. And of course, it's a missed opportunity for innovation, but it's also about health equity, gender equality, and human rights. Just to give you an example about the potential harms that such biases can result in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, 10 drugs, there was a report by the US government that showcased that 10 drugs that they were withdrawn from the market, of those, 8 were causing greater harm to women, some of them because of biological differences with the greater experience of serious adverse events, and others because differential consumption patterns, which led to, again, harms, and that's why those drugs were withdrawn from the market altogether. In another example, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, which is the regulatory agency approving drugs, issued drug safety communication note lowering the dose of Ambien, which is a widely used drug, to half, but only for women, because following the marketing, they had seen that there is a differences in the metabolism of a drug, and women have a slower metabolism and as such have experienced greater side effects following, greater adverse events following taking that drug. And these are surprising why these differences are not captured before a drug is approved and marketed. As mentioned, reproducibility is really a cornerstone of science. And it was an interesting quote that I liked, that replication is what separates the rigor of science from the squishiness of pseudoscience. And we know that in multiple, again, our education in terms of scientists and researchers in a variety of guidelines, reproducibility seems to be a very important point that we all try to kind of strive for, but not considering the differences of sex and gender into a research and not reporting that can really undermine reproducibility, and as such also cause a waste of research. And we know that there is a reproducibility crisis, and some of that is due to, again, 25% according to one study is due to poor data analysis and reporting practices. But it's also about scientific rigor. I really like this example. So this graph shows the relationship between family income and obesity, and it includes both sexes. And looking at that, you can see that with an increasing family income, there is again, lower risk of household members being overweight, obesity. But however, when you're disaggregating data, you simply actually see opposite trends for women as in men. So not disaggregating data can give you a misleading findings that you would actually see that the difference might be very again, opposite for women as in for men in this case. So it's really important to also keep in mind that this is also about good science. And with regard to human rights implication, there are human rights documents that indicates that partial and gender biased research that ignores the experience of women and other marginalized population violate the right of all to equal and non-discriminatory access to health services, the right to enjoy the benefits of and protection from harmful effects of scientific and technological developments, and as well as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the obligation of states to ensure that data collection and use reflect the real world experience of women, and that any conclusion reached are supportive of equality. And of course, that applies to gender nonconforming people and men as well. So whose responsibility is it to address sex and gender bias in research? We know that in the research ecosystem, there are a number of different gatekeeping functions, and all of us have put the hat, had been in those capacities through our research and academic careers as well. Research funding bodies usually fund research, and again, that's a rigorous peer-reviewed process. Clinical governance, research ethics committees approves research protocols before research has been allowed to be conducted. Peer-reviewed journals and editors also importantly play a very important role in maintaining a standard of research and ensuring that what is contributing to the body of evidence is a rigorous and ethical research. And of course, regulatory agencies play an important role in terms of approving interventions and drugs and vaccines and allowing them to enter into the market. And all of those functions play a very important role in terms of reinforcing, educating, and encouraging greater and more systematic inclusion of sex and gender. Now, with the SAGER guideline, we decided to focus on the peer-reviewed journals, very simple, because at that time I was an editor and I thought, in my capacity, I have the power and the position that I can try to enforce such a policy to improve the reporting of sex and gender in my journals. And of course, when I was elected in the Council of the European Association of Science Editors, I saw a great opportunity to be able to do that with a group of people that had similar views, and we could together try to drive a change. And editors have historically played a very important role to setting a high standard for academic research and reporting practices to ensure, again, ethical research, ethical conduct, transparency, completeness, and importantly, also encouraging and improving reproducibility of findings and supporting the contribution to the body of evidence that leads to policies, practices, and interventions. The SAGER guidelines were developed in 2016 as a tool to really drive that change. And they were initially developed to address the persistent sex and gender biases in reporting practices, but they can also be applied to research across the different sectors and different disciplines, and with the aim of filling the gender evidence gap. And it provides a set of recommendations to encourage systematic reporting of sex and gender dimensions in research and data analysis, as well as a number of tools that can be used to that end. Now, I will walk you through the SAGER guidelines with the recommendation, and then I'm hoping that we can open up for a conversation. So the SAGER guidelines apply to all research with humans, animals, or any material originating from humans and animals, as well as other disciplines whose results will be applied to humans, such as mechanics and engineering and technology these days, and artificial intelligence and digital technologies as well. The SAGER guidelines provide some overarching and general principles to guide researchers and authors when conducting their research and reporting their findings. Importantly, to try to be mindful in terms of using sex and gender carefully in order to avoid confusing both terms. Specifically, again, referring to that where the subjects of research comprise organisms capable of differentiation by sex, then the research should be designed and conducted in a way that can reveal sex-related differences in the results. And if the subject can be differentiated by gender, the research should also be conducted similarly at this additional level of distinction. Recommendations of the SAGER guideline follows the traditional structure of academic publications, focusing on title and abstract, again, mentioning if one sex or gender is included in the study, the title as well, the abstract should specify the sex of the animals or any cells, tissues, or other material derived from these, and the sex or gender of human participants. SAGER recommendation number 2 emphasizes the importance of doing due diligence and looking at past literature to understand whether your study in the past has shown indication of potential sex or gender differences that might have been interesting to keep in mind when designing the study, or at least look at the data when analyzing the study. And that is important to keep in mind, that obviously not always specifically historically this aspect has been reported regularly, but there are enough literature that showcases where such differences could be expected. The methods section is very important because it's important to be very transparent and clear and comprehensive in terms of how sex and gender have been taken into account in the design of the study, whether adequate representation were ensured, and the reason for any exclusions should be really provided, and that exclusion should be justified. And this is going to be very important because while we understand that obviously not a research project might be, again, have the possibility to collect the data or provide the data if the research has already been designed and done, and this is at the time of reporting, it's really important to be transparent and comprehensive in terms of the sources of data and the methods used to collect the data on sex or gender to enhance accuracy or minimize confusion, improve reliability, and also allow for meaningful interpretation. And with that, I mean that when we are talking about that we are reporting data by sex, it's also being clear about how was the information about sex collected. Was it through genotyping? Was it examination of reproductive anatomy? Was it the legally recognized sex in the legal documents? Or is it the self-reported sex assigned at birth? Or is it simply an assumption made by the researcher or the provider? And similarly, with regard to the gender, if this is a self-reported gender identity, or is it a researcher or provider reported gender based on, again, appearances, or is it based on documentations? So the clarity around that is particularly important also in terms of allowing studies to be reproducible. And it's important to also look beyond just differences between sexes or genders. Sometimes it's also important to keep in mind what are the other potential gender-related factors or variables or dimensions that one needs to look at and collect data or design for. And one of those very obvious examples was issues around the menstruation, for instance. It was probably all the women that are participating in this webinar would recognize that there was a number of studies or reports of menstrual cycle disruption following COVID-19 vaccination. And there was a very lack of evidence whether that was a result of COVID-19 infection or vaccination. But following that, it was clear that such information was not collected through clinical trials. So there was a lot of uncertainty about the impact and the duration of such disruption and how it would have an impact on the broader health and well-being of women, and whether that would be actually a longer disruption or it's a transitional one. So again, all of those information could have been collected more systematically throughout the clinical trial design and data collection. The results section is obviously the most important one, where we encourage that data should be routinely presented disaggregated by sex. And where appropriate, meaningful sex and gender-based analysis should be reported regardless of outcome. Now, again, at the time of publication, we also recognize that most of the research has been completed and done, and it is sometimes not possible to carry out a subgroup analysis or a sex and gender-based analysis. However, providing data disaggregated by sex can allow for future pooling and meta-analysis. And also, potential subgroup analysis can also provide indication, even if a conclusion cannot be made, in case any future research should be better designed to keep in mind and specifically examine for such differences. When it comes to clinical trials, data on withdrawals and dropouts should also be reported disaggregated by sex or gender, because these are really important indications that often are being overlooked. I mean, systematically, most of the clinical trial reporting does not disaggregate that data by sex. However, those could provide very important indication. I mean, you can see this is a study done in specifically related to Ebola vaccine. And there is quite a large number of both consent not given or consent withdrawn, or people that they have been absent. And it's important to be able to analyze those. Sometimes the clinical trial discontinuation could be because of greater adverse event. And that's very important to understand whether certain group of people will experience a greater side events, which would be a kind of important medical aspect to consider. But it could also be that the way that the clinical trial is operated does not facilitate or is not convenient for certain population to participate. Oftentimes, women who have multiple domestic and care responsibilities, in addition to paid responsibilities, might not find the time or the resources or the means to be able to participate over a longer period of time in clinical trials. So there might be both sex-related and gender-related factors that are hidden in those data, which are important to look at. The same goes with reporting of adverse events, and this is studies across COVID-19 vaccine that we show almost none of them reported side events, neither the systematic ones nor the local ones by sex or gender. And we saw, obviously, following the marketing and with the surveillance data, that there were differences that was observed that is important to be able to communicate clearly about in order to also avoid or reduce both uncertainty and vaccine hesitation. And we know, specifically in immunology and vaccination, we know that most of the vaccines have a differential profile when it comes to sex differences, both in the immune response as well as experience of adverse event, with women often experiencing greater immune response as well as greater adverse reactions. Finally, recommendation number 5 encourages authors to put their findings into a bigger context and also elaborate on the implications of their sex and gender-based analysis and their findings or lack of such analysis to inform the readers whether such differences or aspects were expected or could have implications in terms of generalizability or applicability of this finding to broader populations, if particularly there has been an underrepresentation of particular groups. And again, trying to provide insights that can guide future research efforts. The SAGER guidelines also offer a checklist for researchers and authors. Again, the checklists are primarily meant for gender-sensitive reporting to improve the quality of reporting, but those checklists and the concepts and the recommendations can also very easily be used and applied to research design as well as review of research, both in terms of research ethics committees involvement or peer reviewers. And we also offer a flowchart for editors in order to improve the screening of the manuscript as they go through the editorial process, allowing the editors to engage in a conversation with the authors in order to improve the reporting of these dimensions in the manuscripts that are being published. Now, the SAGER guidelines have been widely adopted and cited. I just noted that we have passed over 1 million article accesses. It has been translated into several other languages, and we welcome others who would like to volunteer to translate those in other languages as well. SAGER guidelines are now widely adopted by the major academic publishers, the Lancet, Elsevier's, BMJ's, Nature, Springer, Cells, and also listed as a part of the Equator Network, and recently adopted by the WHO and is being implemented, which has a wider implication because it not only applies to WHO staff, but also applies and extends beyond WHO's own workforce and will need to be followed by all the collaborating partners and anyone engaged with WHO in using and producing evidence. And other organizations and entities have also endorsed the SAGER guidelines. And it's important to see the SAGER guidelines as a tool that can improve accuracy, transparency, and completeness of research, publish and reduce waste in research, and kind of really knowing that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So unless we actually look at whether there are differences or dimensions related to sex and gender, we will not be able to find them. We do have a module on the SAGER guidelines in the Researcher Academy, which is available for everyone to take part in if you're interested.